Good afternoon. My name is Mary Ann Parker, and I am the Secretary of Friends of the Library, and we help the Wayne County Public Library with their programming that they do for literacy and especially with children's programming. And I was a school librarian for the Wayne County Public School System for over 30 years and read lots of stories to boys and girls. So today I wanted to read a story that I always enjoyed reading for story time called The Little House. It was written by Virginia Lee Burton, and it won the Caldecott Medal the year that it was published in 1942 for being the best illustrated children's book that year. It's one of my favorite stories. Even though it's an old one, it still is a good one. So let's read The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton. Once upon a time, there was a little house way out in the country. And you can see the little house right here. It looks like she has a smile on her face. She was a pretty little house, and she was strong and well built. The man who built her so well said, "This little house shall never be sold for gold or silver, and she will live to see our great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren living in her." And here's the man who built the little house and their children. The little house was very happy as she sat on the hill, and she watched the countryside all around her. She watched the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening. Day followed day, each one a little different from the one before, but the little house just always stayed the same. In the nights, she watched the moon grow from a thin new moon to a full moon and then to a thin old moon. And when there was no moon, she watched the stars way off in the distance. She could see the lights of the city way off, and she was curious about the city. The little house wondered what it would be like to live there. And here you see the lights of the city in the background. Time passed quickly for the little house as she watched the countryside change with the seasons. In the spring, when the days grew longer and the sun was warmer, she waited for the first robin to return from the south. She watched the grass turn green, and she watched the buds on the trees swell. And she watched all of the apple trees bursting into blossom. She watched the children playing in the brook that ran in front of the little house. In the long summer days, she sat in the sun and watched the trees cover themselves with leaves. She watched the white daisies covering the hill in front of her, and she watched the gardens growing. She watched apples turn red and ripen, and she watched the children swimming in the pond. In the fall of the year, when the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, she watched the first frost, and the leaves changed to bright yellow and then orange and red. She watched the harvest gathered, and the apples were picked. She watched the children getting ready to go back to school. Here you see all the children are getting on the wagon to head to school, and you don't see the cars that we have today. In the winter, when the nights were long and the days were short, and the countryside was covered with snow, she watched the children coasting and skating on the hill in front of her. Year followed year. The apple trees grew old and new ones were planted. The children grew up and went away into the city. And now at night, the lights of the city seemed much brighter and closer than before. One day, the little house was surprised to see a horseless carriage coming down the winding country road. Pretty soon there were more of them and fewer carriages pulled by horses. Pretty soon along came some surveyors, and you can see them right here. They surveyed a line in front of the little house. And then, after that, along came a steam shovel. And that steam shovel dug a road right through the hill covered with daisies. Then some trucks came along and started dumping big stones on the road. And then some more trucks came with little stones to dump onto the road. And then some more trucks came with sand and tar. And finally a big steamroller came and rolled it all smooth, and the road was done in front of the little house. Now the little house watched the trucks and automobiles going back and forth to the city. Gasoline stations, roadside stands, and small houses followed the new road. Everyone and everything moved much faster now than before. Here you see the little house is still sitting there, watching everything go by. More roads were made, and the countryside was divided into lots. More houses and bigger houses, apartment houses and tenement houses, schools, stores, and garages spread over the land and crowded around the little house. No one wanted to live in her and take care of her any longer. She could not be sold for gold or silver, and so the little house just sat there and watched. Now it was not so quiet and peaceful at night. The lights of the city were bright and very close, and the street lights shone all night. This must be living in the city, thought the little house, and she didn't know whether she liked it or not. She missed her field of daisies, and she missed those apple trees dancing in the moonlight. Can you see her? She's still right here. Now pretty soon along came some trolley cars going back and forth in front of the little house. They went back and forth all day and part of the night. Everyone seemed to be very busy, and everyone seemed to be going very quickly, in such a hurry from place to place. Pretty soon there was an elevated train going back and forth above the little house. The air was filled with dust and smoke, and the noise was so loud it shook the little house. Now she couldn't tell when spring came, or summer, fall, or winter. It all just stayed the same. You can see her right here. Pretty soon there was a subway going back and forth underneath the little house. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it and she could feel it. People were moving faster and faster. No one noticed the little house anymore. They hurried by her without even a glance. Here she is, just still sitting there. Pretty soon they tore down all those apartment houses and tenement houses around the little house, and they started digging deep cellars, one on each side of the little house. Pretty soon they started building up, 25 stories on one side, 35 stories on the other side. Now the little house only saw the sun at noon, and she never saw the moon and stars at night at all, because the lights of the city were very bright. She didn't like living in the city. At night, she used to dream of the country and the field of daisies and the apple trees that were dancing in the moonlight. The little house was very sad and lonely. Her paint was cracked and dirty. Her windows were broken, and her shutters hung crookedly. She looked very shabby, even though she was just as good a house as ever underneath. And here you see her, very sad. Then one fine morning in springtime, along came the great-great-granddaughter of the man who built the little house so well. And you can see her right here with her husband and her children. She saw the shabby little house, but the granddaughter did not hurry by. There was something about the little house that made her stop and look again. She said to her husband, "You know, this looks just like the little house that my grandmother lived in when she was a little girl, only that little house was way out in the country on a hill covered with daisies, and there were apple trees growing all around it." Now they found out that it was indeed the very same house, and so they went to the movers to see if they could move the little house. And the movers looked the house all over, and she said, "You know, this little house is as good as new. She's built so well we could move her anywhere." So they jacked up the little house and put her on wheels. Traffic was held up for hours as they slowly moved the little house from her foundation out of the city. And the granddaughter and her family are in the car right in front of them. At first, the little house was very frightened, but after she got used to it, she rather liked it. They rolled along the big road, and they rolled along the little roads until they were way out in the country. When the little house saw green grass and heard the birds singing, she was no longer sad. They went along and they went along, but they couldn't seem to find just the right spot to put her. They tried the little house here and they tried the little house there. Finally, they saw a hill in the middle of a field, and there were apple trees growing all around it. "There," said the great-great-granddaughter, "there is just the place." "Yes, it is," said the little house to herself. A cellar was dug on top of the hill, and very slowly they moved the little house from the road onto her new spot on top of the hill. The windows and the shutters were fixed, and once again they painted her a lovely shade of pink. As the little house settled down on her new foundation, she smiled happily. Once again she could watch the moon and the sun and the stars. She could watch the seasons change from spring to summer, from fall to winter. Once again, she was lived in and taken care of. Never again would she be curious about the city. Never again would she want to live there. The stars twinkled above her. There was a new moon coming up. It was springtime, and all was quiet and peaceful in the country. And that's the end of The Little House by Virginia Lee Burton.